Solo Leveling by Gong. Bonus Stories 9. Important people had gathered in the White House of the United States of America. The leaders of the nation sitting in the meeting room looked nervous. One of them seemed especially concerned. The United States President rubbed his face as he debated over and over whether he had made the right decision. The sky opened, and something started to come out of it. This type of incident had been unheard of until now. Could the government take care of this unprecedented situation without letting its citizens know? Was it even possible to get rid of those things coming out of the rift? The president, who had been anxiously awaiting word from the person in charge of the matter, sprang up from his seat when General Chester Harrison, the commanding officer of the military in that area, entered the room. "Harrison, what happened?" The last report the president had received had been, "The situation has been resolved. I repeat, the situation has been resolved." But there had been no explanation provided on how it had been resolved. That was why the worried leaders had gathered in this room. General Harrison briefly greeted the president first, looked around, and then walked to the very front of the room. "It'll be easier for me to show you this footage than explain things with words." He held up a USB. The curious president quickly nodded his assent. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone focused on the little device. Harrison plugged the USB in, and a video began playing on the huge screen on the wall. "This footage was filmed by drones and electronics at the scene." General Harrison gave a brief introduction and then swallowed hard. He couldn't fathom how the people gathered in this room would react to the video. Harrison himself had watched the video several times and did not know what to think of it. However, the most important thing about this footage was that it had really happened. The evidence of it was on the USB, and Harrison had a duty to show them as the person in charge of this matter. The video began with the cracks. "Oh! Ah!" Gasps echoed throughout the room as giants made of rock walked out of the cracks where space itself seemed to shatter. The room would have erupted into chaos had they not already received advance reports of these creepy creatures. But what happened next was more shocking. The giants were horrifying enough that the mere sight of them could give someone a heart attack. Yet there was someone standing in front of them all by themselves. Judging by the size of their frame, a young man? Maybe an Asian? The Secretary of Defense was unable to restrain himself and angrily pointed at the screen. "That man! Who is that man? Where are all the soldiers? And why is this civilian standing in the middle of those creatures, General Harrison?" He was right. This wasn't a recording of the U.S. military's most elite soldiers defeating the alien creatures, as everyone had expected. Instead, the footage featured a man whose face and age were a mystery. Suddenly, on the screen, shadowy black soldiers rose from the ground. General Harrison sounded plaintive as he stared at the screen. "I would like to know that as well. Did you think I was alone?" As per Jinwoo's command, close to 10 million shadow soldiers stood at attention. Several hundred titans lumbered out of the rifts. Normally, the outcome of such a fight would be obvious, but the problem was that each titan possessed the strength of higher beings. Ba dump, be a dump. Jinwoo's heart raced, since it had been a while since he fought in a war. He signaled to Fong, who commanded the mage soldiers. "You ready?" "Yes, my lord." All the mage soldiers, including Fong, had been ordered to cast a spell that minimized the damage of the battle. Jinwoo had no choice, since this world was weak due to the severe lack of mana. These uninvited guests were also likely to hold back from using powerful magic, since their mission was to consume the land. The war about to be waged would inevitably be a physical fight between Jinwoo's army and these enemies. A battle of strength versus strength. Good. Luckily, Jin Woo didn't mind that kind of fight. A smirk appeared on his face. One of the Titans misunderstood Jin Woo's smile and immediately threw a furious punch his way. Bam! But his target, Jin Woo, was already in the air. He spryly leaped up as if pole vaulting and then landed on the Titan's fist as light as a feather. The Titan was now stunned by the sight of the smiling human on his hand and felt extremely uneasy. Sure enough, the human then ran up the giant's arm. Talk, 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 talk. Jin Woo had already passed the giant's shoulder and was headed for its neck in the blink of an eye. Soon, the dagger in Jin Woo's hand penetrated the Titan's neck. Arg! It was like keying a car. Jin Woo held tightly onto the dagger stuck in the Titan's neck and ran around to the Titan's other shoulder, leaving a line in its wake. Shahunk! The black aura on the tip of the dagger cleanly separated the Titan's neck from its body. What? Jin Woo stood on the decapitated Titan's shoulder and looked over at its brethren. He could sense their anger, frustration, and fear. It reminded him of how it had felt hunting the monarchs one by one in the gap between dimensions. He had succeeded in breaking the Titan's fighting spirit, and his goal now was to annihilate them. Jin Woo finally mobilized his shadow army. Soldiers, charge! He could sense his army begin to move below him. Reiwa, as their commander, I can't just sit back. That wasn't the fighting style of the Shadow Monarch. Jin Woo scanned the Titans for his next target. One of the Titans made eye contact with Jin Woo and flinched. The fearful enemy was struck down first. Jin Woo brandished a dagger brimming with aura as he leaped toward the Titan. It wasn't Kamish wrath, but the quality of the weapon didn't matter. He'd honed his control over the black aura over 27 years in battle. The black aura emanating from the tip of Jin Woo's dagger spread out in front of him and split open the face of the frozen Titan. SHHK. And just like that, the fearsome Titan lost its life. But not every Titan was a coward. Jin Woo's eyes widened. Behind the Titan with the split face, other Titans were converging and trying hard to capture him. Jin Woo pushed himself lower in order to escape a huge fist coming straight toward him, then flew back up to avoid the tip of a hand coming in hot from behind. The skilled ruler's authority had become second nature to him, so Jin Woo was able to move freely through the air. The enemy's power was beyond his expectations. He kicked away a Titan's fist coming down like a hammer. Then came another Titan's hand coming from one side. Jin Woo quickly brought his arms in and crouched to make himself a smaller target as he braced for impact. Pow! Before he could go flying, he used mana to pull the Titan's hand back toward him and slashed at its wrist. SHHHHK. The Titan flung its head back as it grabbed its cut wrist. Arg! Jin Woo quickly maneuvered himself to the Titan's neck and stabbed it near its Adam's apple. Crack! The huge body of another Titan was felled by Jin Woo's accurate attack. He launched off this Titan's chest and began severing the hands of other Titans relentlessly coming after him. As Jin Woo jumped into the air to avoid a Titan's hand swinging at him at full strength, he took a good look around him. Just then, two different Titans slammed him between their shoulders. Bam! Jin Woo stuck his hands out to keep from getting crushed. He then pushed with all his might and sent them flying with his bare hands. Ugh! How is that possible with such a small body? While some Titans were shocked that Jin Woo was physically stronger than they were, one Titan calmly made its move and slammed its palm down like smashing a bug. Rah! Jin Woo roared and spat out a powerful amount of mana. The Titan, flustered as its hand was pushed back, saw the black fist coming right at it too late. Kapow! Jin Woo had concentrated the black energy to his right arm and enlarged it to the size of a titan's arm before knocking the giant's head clean off. Jinwoo eventually wrapped his entire body in a black aura to expand his whole frame before mercilessly going after the titans. Between the shadow army swarming around like ravenous beasts and the titans made of stone, the outcome was quickly decided. In the middle of titans that had been brought to their knees stood the giant shadow, ripping a titan's arm clean off and crushing it to dust with its bare hands. Crack! The titans surrounding Jinwoo were shocked by his power and retreated a few steps back. Puzzled, Jinwoo gazed at them in suspicion, only for a titan larger and seemingly stronger than the others to approach him. Ah! The voice, however, came from a little creature perched on the titan's shoulder. I see that even this tiny planet on the outskirts of the universe has its gifts. It was a small, humanoid version of the stone titans. But enlarging your body in order to maximize your power is evidence that your race is still savage. On the other hand, we, the titans, decrease our size like this when we reveal our full power. It laughed as it gestured to itself. Ha ha! Naturally, only the best warriors such as I can do this. Jinwoo listened to him, unamused. Suddenly, he turned his head to one side. Flash! In the nick of time, Jinwoo avoided a beam of red light that shot out from behind him and instantly disintegrated the best warrior of the Titans. The red light came from a panicking Bellion astride an ancient dragon. Oh dear, were you in the middle of conversation with it, my lord? Jinwoo waved his hand to indicate that it was okay. These guys are quite arrogant, so I'll let you take care of them. Please leave it to me, my lord. Bellion bowed his head and flew off. Jinwoo looked at the Titans again. He had already defeated quite a lot of them, and the rest were being swept up by a black wave of shadow soldiers. Arg! Gaw! The screams of the rock giants filled the desert. Dead silence. That was the only way to describe the atmosphere of the room. It was so quiet. It was like everyone had frozen into blocks of ice. The United States president struggled to find the right words to say after watching the footage. That man. Have you learned his identity? The general shook his head. The true monster had destroyed the horrifying creatures like they were toys and saved the United States without a single civilian noticing. In fact, he probably saved the entire world. Yet the kind of power that could save the whole world could also destroy it. The president concluded that uncovering the mystery man's identity was a priority. Is there any way to find out who this man in the video is? While some suggestions were offered, the room generally believed this to be an impossibility. However, it's impossible, realistically speaking. Emphasis on the realistically. It was David Brannon, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The president turned his head toward Brannon. What are you saying? The director proceeded with caution. If it's impossible, realistically speaking, then how about an unrealistic approach? When the others blinked at him in confusion, Brannon smiled. There is a way. There is a person who has told us things impossible to have known through realistic methods. Could he mean? There was a woman known by every single person living in the United States whose special relationship with the CIA was a well-known secret. The president's eyes widened. Do you mean? Director Brannon confidently nodded. Yes, Mrs. Norma Sellner. I'm sure she'll once again have the answer we're looking for. A black sedan slowed as it arrived in front of a cozy house with a red roof in a suburban residential area. Director Brannon of the CIA and two of his subordinates exited the car. Brannon glanced at the house and gave an order. You guys, wait here. Director Brannon. The subordinates hesitated at the difficult order as they were there to protect him, but the director was stubborn. "It's fine, it's fine." Brennan waved him away. "Mrs. Sellner likes to keep things low-key." The director left his subordinates next to the car and walked toward the house alone. He took a second to straighten his outfit, then cautiously knocked on the door. "Mrs. Sellner, it's me. It's A child opened the door before he could complete his sentence. Director Brennan recognized Mrs. Sellner's grandson and crouched down to be eye level to him. He patted the kid on the head. "Is your grandmother home? She's been waiting for you, Mr. Mustache." As the boy pointed at him, Brennan chuckled. Of course she was. After all, she was a psychic, a prophet, an esper, and the best fortune teller in the world. That wasn't to say Brennan had always trusted her, but after witnessing her supernatural powers solve difficult cases even the CIA had given up on, he'd had no choice but to believe. She was the real deal. A true superhuman. It was probably easier for Mrs. Sellner to predict a visit from an unannounced visitor than it was for her to change the TV channel with a remote. Brennan followed the child into the living room and politely greeted her as she put her cup of tea down on the table. "It has been a while, Mrs. Sellner." "Welcome, Dave." It had been about a year ago since his last visit, but the living room hadn't changed. He slowly took a seat on the couch. "You probably can't imagine how hard our job has been since you retired, Mrs. Sellner." As valuable as information of the past could be, it couldn't hold a candle to information of the future. It had been a huge loss for the CIA when Mrs. Sellner stopped working for them. The director's tone was joking, but he couldn't hide his wistfulness. Mrs. Sellner admonished him, as if he was a child whining for a cookie. "I've already told you, Dave. I've been unable to see anything from the future since his visit." Was she talking about the god of death again? Brennan bitterly smacked his lips at the same response she'd given so many times before. According to her, she had been rendered powerless as a result of a mighty power appearing in this world. Director Brennan never knew how to respond to that, as he couldn't fathom why she would quit working with the CIA. An awkward silence fell over them. Smelling some food in the air, the director broke the tension. "Were you in the middle of a meal, Mrs. Sellner?" Mrs. Sellner shook her head. "Actually, I have another guest." "Oh, is that so?" It was surprising that Mrs. Sellner, who wasn't fond of meeting others, had another guest. Brennan decided to get down to business and wipe the smile from his face. "Then I'll cut to the chase, so I don't take up much more of your time." Mrs. Sellner was already fully aware of what he was about to ask. "My answer to your first question is yes, and my answer to your second question is no." "Wait." Mrs. Sellner grinned at the flustered director. "Are you wondering how I knew what you were going to ask even though I can no longer see into the future?" "Yes. You already chose your questions in the past, Dave. I simply put my answers together by looking at the past." "Oh." Brennan groaned quietly and nodded. "Shall I elaborate now?" The director took out a handkerchief and dabbed his forehead. "Go ahead, Mrs. Sellner." "Yes, Dave. I do indeed know the identity of the man you seek." Her answer to his first question was yes, but her answer to his second question was no. "However, I shall not tell you anything about him." "Mrs. Sellner." The director's voice grew louder out of frustration. "I'm sure you're aware of what that man has done. We can't just let him get away with." Mrs. Sellner snapped at him. "That is exactly why I will not tell you." That had never happened before. Director Brennan didn't know how to react at seeing her angry for the first time. However, Mrs. Sellner wasn't done. "Are your eyes just for decoration?" "Excuse me? Didn't you see the video on the USB, Director Brennan?" Brandon had plainly seen that man stand up to those terrifying monsters on his own. The man possessed a horrifying amount of power, but he had saved humanity.
What if I told you that was not the first time such an event occurred?
Mrs. Sellner seemed to be completely serious, so Brandon froze. Not the first time? The thought of humankind not knowing it had been on the brink of extinction before gave him chills. But when he thought about it, he realized that only a small handful of United States government personnel had been privy to this incident. It was totally possible a similar situation could have occurred elsewhere in the world that they were unaware of. He could be as she claims. Director Brandon rubbed his chin in thought.
I trust you, Mrs. Sellner.
Although he had only known her for about 3 years, it felt like Brandon had known Mrs. Sellner for much longer than that, so he had an unshakable faith in her for reasons even he couldn't describe. When she nodded, he cautiously asked her another question.
The man in the video, can you swear that he doesn't pose a threat?
She responded without hesitation.
I swear.
The director nodded slowly and came to a decision.
Understood. I'm going to pretend like you don't know that man.
With a bittersweet look on his face, Brandon got up from his seat.
Well then,
he said his goodbyes and turned to leave, but Mrs. Sellner's warm voice stopped him.
Dave, I baked some cookies. Would you like one for the road?
Gazing at the bag of cookies in her hand, the director declined her offer with a smile.
No, thank you, Mrs. Sellner.
Now that official business was over, Brandon looked more relaxed. Mrs. Sellner smiled warmly at him and called out to her grandson to see him out. Having taken a liking to Mr. Mustache, the child promptly showed up and took Brandon by the hand.
I'll be seeing you, Mrs. Sellner. Bye-bye, Dave.
As the director let himself be led out by Mrs. Sellner's grandson, the guest hiding on the other side of the living room wall walked back into the room.
I don't like that old man, Granny. Want me to take care of him?
The big guy with slick-back blonde hair took a handful of cookies from the bag Brandon had rejected and stuffed them into his mouth.
If you cause any more trouble, you'll be suspended from the league, won't you, Thomas?
Thomas awkwardly laughed and chewed the cookies. Crunch, crunch.
Well.
It was Thomas Andre, UFC heavyweight champion and one of Mrs. Sellner's few friends, though that fact was unbeknownst to the general public. If reporters found out, they'd have a field day. Thomas looked as at home in Mrs. Sellner's house, as if he was visiting an aunt's place. Still unsatisfied after polishing off the cookies, he snatched the bag from her to shake the crumbs into his mouth.
Granny, can I ask you something?
As Mrs. Sellner smiled and nodded at him, Thomas crumpled the empty bag into a ball.
A lot of people die from accidents.
Many died from car accidents, except those who got a call from Mrs. Sellner. It had been his first day off in a while, and Thomas had planned to take his beloved sports car out for a spin, but he was lucky enough to receive one such call. When he checked, he found that one of his wheels had a nail stuck in it. Without her warning, he would have surely gotten into a deadly car accident. In other words, Mrs. Sellner was Thomas's savior. Ever since then, the two had grown close enough to share meals like this. But one thing had always remained a mystery.
Why did you save me?
It wasn't like she'd been desperate to save him because she was a fan of the UFC. Thomas had always been curious as to why Mrs. Sellner had initially called him. At his question, she stared at the now athlete's face in silence for a while before answering.
It's because you did many good things in your previous life. I did?
Thomas Andre was called the bad boy, or even devil, of the UFC. For a moment, he wondered if she had eaten something bad, but he kept his initial response to himself out of respect for his savior.
Ha ha!
Mrs. Sellner laughed, then shifted her gaze to watch the director get into his car outside the window. Her grandson waved at Mr. Mustache until he couldn't see the car anymore. Relationships. Mrs. Sellner considered it destiny that relationships from their previous life continued in life, whether by design or not. After making sure the coast was clear, Thomas plopped on the couch where Director Brannon had been seated earlier.
So what did the man do in the footage? Why are they looking for him?
Mrs. Sellner spoke casually, as if she was talking about the laundry.
He saved the world.
Thomas couldn't tell if Mrs. Sellner was joking or not, though this is why it's fun to be around her. Thomas put on the sunglasses he usually wore and asked her another question.
Then what is the hero who saved the world doing now?
Mrs. Sellner smiled to herself as she watched her grandson return inside.
Who knows? Perhaps he's enjoying his youth somewhere.
Yeah. Cheers rang out at the qualifying round of the National Track and Field Student Athlete Competition. There were sparks in the eyes of the team captains as two rival schools ran into each other.
Hey, Taiwoong, you must be desperate to put a freshman in every event.
Kaisuk Jo, the captain of the track and field team of Hwasong Tech High School, taunted Jinwoo's team. The two schools were longtime rivals.
Sanjin takes a break for a few months, and now your worthless team is relying on a freshman?
Taiwoong patted Jinwoo's shoulder as he sneered at Kaisuk's continuous jibes.
This freshman is going to make you eat your words. Huh. At least your sense of humor is better than your record.
Jinwoo was troubled as he observed their argument. They're making it harder for me to lay low. Kaisuk's confidence grew as he caught Jinwoo's frown.
You know, this is quite a coincidence.
He gestured at his team members, and the confident big guy standing at the back of the group strode forward.
We have a pretty monstrous rookie, too.
Jinwoo recognized the rookie's face and inadvertently let out a gasp.
Huh? Looks like your freshie's feeling the heat, isn't he?
The rival rookie was more muscular than any high schooler around. Kaisuk put his hand on the rookie's shoulder and loudly introduced him.
Meet Hwasong Tech High School's secret weapon, freshman Chul Kim.
An overwhelming impulse, so powerful that all rationality flew out the window, engulfed Chul. Why do I feel like? Why did Chul want to kneel in front of a student his age he was meeting for the first time in his life? If he hadn't put all his energy into locking his ankles and calves, he would have embarrassed himself in front of everyone, but it was a close call. He wiped the cold sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand. Then a thought hit him. No way. Am I afraid of a dude in the same grade as me? How else could Chul explain why his breathing got faster? He instinctually avoided eye contact, and he felt weak in the knees. But he couldn't bring himself to believe this. Yeah, right. Chul Kim boasted an extraordinary, huge physique for a high school student, and he'd stood out because of it since middle school. So why on earth would he be scared? It made no sense, and he refused to acknowledge that it was happening.
Chul, what's wrong? Are you not feeling well?
At his upperclassman's worry, Chul firmly replied,
I'm completely fine.
Right. There was nothing wrong with him. Chul nodded like he was trying to convince himself. I'm probably just feeling dizzy because I didn't have enough to eat for breakfast. To prove this to himself, Chul slowly raised his head and looked directly at the freshman from the rival school. He was fit for a freshman, but still a beanpole compared to Chul. Chul finally relaxed and smirked. See? How could he be intimidated by someone he could potentially send flying with one punch? There was absolutely no way for him to be. Chul straightened his shoulders, his arrogant expression from before returning. The track team from Hwasong Tech High School had been worried by Chul's sudden mood swing, but they were relieved to see that he was fine now.
You scared me there for a minute. Who knew our freshman was such a good actor?
Chul accepted the pats of encouragement from his team and then fixed his gaze on Jin-woo. That was freaking humiliating. Why did I have to get dizzy right when I made eye contact with him? Chul mulled over how to get back at the other freshman. The best way would be to assert his dominance. Considering how the other freshmen seemed to be glaring at him, he shouldn't let him get away with something like that.
Hey!
Chul deepened his voice on purpose and pointed to the other end of the field.
I have something to say to you, so come with me.
Oh! The Hwasong Tech High School track team egged on their feisty freshmen. Meanwhile, Jinwoo's team scrambled to stop him from following Chul.
Murder is prohibited, Jin-woo. Control yourself. You can't spill blood on a competition day. Think of it as saving someone's life.
Smiling, Jin-woo shook free of their hold.
Relax. Nothing's going to happen.
The team looked him over for reassurance.
You sure? You're not going to do anything, right? We trust you, okay? We're going to be watching to make sure that guy walks back on his own 2 feet.
Jin-woo laughed and nodded to calm them down and hurried to catch up to Chul. Kaisuk had been watching their entire interaction. He looked incredulous as he approached them.
Are you guys serious?
Taewoon glanced at Kaisuk and then worriedly gazed in the direction Jin-woo had gone.
Don't talk to me. I'm not in the mood now.
Taewoon had seen up close how incredibly athletic Jin-woo was, and he desperately prayed that Chul Kim wouldn't cross the line. As Jin-woo made his way to the other side, he found himself looking forward to what Chul had to say. Had Chul also regained his memories of their previous life? If so, how would the human Chul Kim react to his memories of being Iron the Shadow Soldier? However, based on Chul's expression, that didn't seem to be the case.
Hey you!
Chul gave him a murderous glare.
You think you can look down on me because we're both wearing uniforms and standing on the same field?
Although Chul was angry, Jin-woo grinned inadvertently, as it reminded him of how Chul had fumed inside the Red Gate. He had annoyed Jin-woo back then, but it was all in the past, wasn't it? Meanwhile, Chul, who did not share the same memories, did not find Jin-woo's grin the least bit amusing.
You son of a...
Chul grabbed Jin-woo by the collar. Rayura. As he did, Jin-woo's shadow soldiers roared.
Iron! He's joining us again! Welcome back, Iron! My lord, please leave him to me. I, Bellion, will re-educate him so that this doesn't happen again.
Apparently, Jin-woo needed to teach the shadow soldiers how to adjust to civilized society. Jin-woo sucked his teeth and looked into Chul's eyes. Despite Chul picking a fight, Jin-woo couldn't bring himself to hate him, as he'd been fond of Iron, a loyal shadow soldier. Rather, Jin-woo was rather curious whether Chul would regain his memories if they made physical contact. Chul swallowed nervously, as he sensed something in the depths of Jin-woo's eyes. What is this? Normally, Chul would have just punched someone who made fun of him. Competition be damned. But instead of feeling anger toward this opponent or wanting to seek revenge, he felt a deep tug at his heart. Suddenly, Jin-woo gently wrapped his hand around the hesitant Chul's wrist. As soon as he did, inexplicable tears poured like rain from Chul's eyes. His legs gave out, and he plopped down on the ground.
Why?
Chul looked up at Jin-woo. His eyes were begging for an answer, but Jin-woo could only smile wistfully. Even with physical contact, I guess his memories won't return, since he didn't share the monarch's memories in the past. Jin-woo would have to purposefully restore those memories. Jin-woo recalled the people who had shared his memories during the deleted past. President Jinchul Woo-in, Mrs. Norma Selner, Jin-woo turned to leave, suspecting that Mrs. Sellner might have the memories from the time before. Since Chul Kim was no longer the shadow soldier Iron, Jin-woo didn't have any business with him. Chul called out to Jin-woo before he could get very far.
Hang on. Wait.
Chul quickly got up as he wiped tears from his face. Although he had stopped crying, the tip of his nose was red. As Jin-woo turned back, he spoke with a sob.
Is this what people call love?
He had never experienced such overwhelming emotion before, and was conflating the feeling with love. Jin-woo could only stare at the unexpected question before letting out a deep sigh.
Oh geez.
Jin-woo couldn't leave Chul with such a huge misunderstanding, right? As Jin-woo approached, Chul blushed. Snap! With a snap of Jin-woo's fingers, Chul's face smoothed out and his eyes lost focus. Jin-woo stood in front of him and planted fake memories in his mind.
Okay, so you picked a fight with me, but then you found out I was your father's friend's son, so we're cool now.
Chul nodded in a daze.
And
Jin-woo smiled gently as he recalled the weeping Iron as they bade him farewell, just before he used the cup of reincarnation.
From now on, you should behave yourself. Be proud that you were someone who fought to save the world. Yes.
After Chul replied, Jin-woo released him from the hypnotic hold. Snap! Chul regained consciousness and looked around in confusion. He spotted Jin-woo walking away from him, who waved back at him like they were old friends who hadn't met in a while.
See you next time. Sure.
Chul waved back and smiled at Jin-woo too. Good. Pleased, Jin-woo went on his way. With the unexpected reunion with an old colleague behind him, it was time to search for the person he'd actually come here for. As if on cue, an announcement echoed across the field.
The preliminary round for middle school students will begin shortly. All athletes, please report to the field.
Just then, Hain took a step closer toward Jin-woo and wrapped the scarf she was wearing around his neck.
If you like me, don't take another step.
Huh? Jin-woo was flustered as Hain started walking slowly toward the tree, keeping her eyes on him. He couldn't do anything but laugh as he realized he had lost the bet from the start.
Oh geez.
Hain eventually touched the tree and celebrated victory by hopping lightly on the spot. The shadow soldiers, who had been excitedly monitoring the bet, went nuts.
Whoa! Our king lost? I didn't know that was possible. My lord, you made a mistake. Scrah! My king! You can still make it.
Jin-woo glanced at their surroundings as he walked toward the tree. Fortunately, there was no one else on the street.
I won, right?
Hain's eyes sparkled with excitement as she awaited Jin-woo's answer. He stopped in front of her and gave an order to his soldiers. Shadows, close your eyes. As they obeyed with great disappointment, Jin-woo slowly leaned in closer and closer to Hain's face until their lips touched. Snowflakes continued to gently float down from the sky.